Good afternoon. I'm Jay Nolan, President of Mountain Advocate Media and with Nolan Group Newspapers. We're here this afternoon in Frankfort talking with Governor Matt Bevin. As you know, our section of the state supported Governor Bevin 2-1, 3-1, and in some counties 6-1 in his contest for governor. So we appreciate, Governor, this afternoon taking the time to discuss some issues about rural Kentucky and some of the things that rural Kentucky is facing today. Thank you very much for your time.
You are very welcome, and thank you to all of you in rural Kentucky who did support a kid who grew up in rural America. I'm grateful for that support, I really am.
So the first issue we'd like to discuss with you today, Governor, is one that you're very good at, and that's jobs. Your administration has been recognized nationally now for the jobs and the record level investment you brought into Kentucky. I think the numbers show over $5.8 billion, and in 5 months you smashed a previous year record. Two questions. What's caused your administration to be so successful getting jobs into Kentucky, and what specifically can we expect in rural Kentucky?
There's a couple of things to unpacking that, and believe it or not, it's now up to $7 billion because we've brought in over $1 billion just in the last couple of weeks. So the previous record, as you noted, for new investment into Kentucky in one calendar year was $5.1 billion. We're up to $7 billion, not even yet halfway through the year, getting close. It's an amazing turnaround, and I'm grateful for the recognition, but frankly, the recognition I really don't care about as much as I care about the fact that we are creating jobs and opportunity. And getting outside companies to invest, which is the heart of your question, how do you do it? You pass good policy. And while it was controversial, for example, right-to-work legislation is a big reason. People like to pretend that it's not, but many of the companies that are investing here are doing it because we had passed that legislation. Tort reform, making legal changes, cutting red tape. This little pin that I wear, a pair of scissors, cutting through some red tape, pledging to, and then actually doing, getting rid of excess regulation, making it easier for people to get permits and getting the process of doing business done more simply. This is how you grow jobs. And why are we having success? Because I'm a business guy. This is the first political job I've ever had, and when I talk to other companies, I talk to them business person to business person. And not everyone is going to come to Kentucky, but many will. You asked about what does this mean for rural Kentucky. It means things like Brady Industries building a $1.3 billion plant a bit north of you up in Greenup County. But there are other opportunities, some increasing opportunities now in the southeast as well, down in the London, Corbin area, and then starting to move even into other communities as well. And so part of this, and people know this, it's infrastructure is part of it, but it's not just roads and bridges. It's also internet. It's also access to a trained workforce. The good thing about Kentucky, we've got hard-working people. We've got people who have pride in the things that they do. And nowhere more than Eastern Kentucky do we have that kind of mentality on display. I'm working with the White House right now on trying to designate a region of Eastern Kentucky as an aero-ready region. And so stay tuned on that. I look forward to talking to you more about it, but trying to intentionally focus our nation's our defense industry and aerospace industries on Eastern Kentucky and the caliber of workforce that we have there. I just was at the Paris Air Show last week in France. I was there for about 30 hours, I think. It was a kind of a quick in and out, and had about 15 meetings with different companies. But some of the biggest companies in the world, the Boeings, the Airbuses, the Northrop Grummons, the Lockheed Martins, these are companies that we're talking to, Raytheon, GE, Aviation, etc. Some already have a presence here, some don't, but are looking. And we're going to continue to do that, especially focusing on Eastern Kentucky.
Well, we appreciate that. Also, you talked about Eastern Kentucky and the workforce. So that leads me to my second question. I know in Eastern Kentucky, our test scores are rising pretty rapidly. But your administration's making a lot of changes to education. Some are pretty controversial. How will you know when your changes have been successful? By what will you measure the success of your programs and policies?
It's interesting. I first want to touch on the fact that some are controversial. What's controversial is that we're changing things. And that's what's crazy to me, is that if something is not working as well as we'd like, why would we not look to make it better? So the idea of bringing competition into our education system, of going into districts where schools have failed, which is not so much in Eastern Kentucky, more in our rural or in our urban communities, I should say. Why not go in there and provide alternatives for students and parents to give them the best shot? How do we tell if it's working? If young people can read at grade level, do math at grade level, actually graduate from high school with the skills needed to go on to post-secondary school or education. if they graduate with skills or with certifications or with the ability to go on to learning more without having to do remedial work. And the ultimate way to tell, are they employed? Can they get jobs? If they can't find jobs, then we're wasting the time and effort that could be better applied, perhaps, to focus on helping to educate them for what they're going to experience in the real world. So success is going to be driven by whether or not the young people we're educating are actually able to be productive members of society.
Okay. One of the other things that's very important in rural Kentucky right now is health care. And I know you just came back with a meeting with some other governors talking about Medicare and Medicaid and what's going to happen. And there's a lot going on in D.C. that may affect this, but specifically our acute care hospitals in southeastern and rural Kentucky, really across the state, are life support bridges for so many in rural areas. And given all that's going on, how do you plan to help keep Kentucky's acute care hospitals open?
It's critical that we do. So much of our state is rural. You are right. They are the bridge for people literally between life and death in many instances. Just before we sat down, you overheard part of a conversation I had with another state governor who's also a state that is similar to us. They have a concentration in their biggest cities, but most of their people happen to live in rural areas. And they have some of the very same issues that we do as it relates to drug addiction, as it relates to an unhealthy population, etc. So it's interesting. It's not unique just to Kentucky. Others are challenged with the same thing. What do I intend to do to make sure that Kentucky focuses on healthier outcomes? Just simply providing health insurance or access to health insurance is not enough. We have to make sure that the hospitals and the providers are there, are incentivized to be there, that they are able to continue to exist so that our citizens can have access to health care, so that they can ultimately have healthier outcomes. So no matter what happens in Washington, no matter what legislation comes down, the responsibility will still come down to the states, where we, the states, are going to have to decide individually what is best for our people. How can we make sure that in Kentucky's case, we have the best health outcomes possible for all Kentuckians? That's my responsibility. I've got a great group of people, starting with Secretary Glisson in the Health and Family Services Cabinet, and we wrestle with this issue every single day. Last thing I'll say on this is we're still in the process of working with CMS in Washington, D.C., part of the Health and Human Services Cabinet, on an 1115 waiver that will allow us more flexibility and creativity and allow us to be able to produce better health outcomes for our people.
Okay. You're talking about health outcomes and promoting people and openness in government. You've been probably one of the most strident governors trying to support opening the records and the meetings and the laws of Kentucky to the public. I believe you vetoed some legislation that back in the day would have let school boards keep their spending more private, more on the web. You vetoed legislation that would let public agencies keep their information on government-controlled websites. You said put it out there for everybody. What else do you think we should do in Kentucky to make our government more transparent? What are the next steps you would like to see happen?
Again, I think at every turn out the corruption. Our state, sadly, has been a corrupt state. Other states, we don't have a monopoly on corruption, but a study was done by Harvard back in the summer of 2015, I believe it was. In that summer, they put out a release of all of the states ranked in two categories: legal corruption and illegal corruption. Illegal corruption means it's against the law to do these things, but it's still happening in some states. Legal corruption, which is an odd word, is one where it should be illegal, but it's not in that particular state. So what do I want to see happen? I want to see both the legal and illegal corruption swept out of our state. Our people deserve better. Our taxpayers deserve better. So I'll continue to challenge people. I think it's why you see a lot of the people spinning. Our Attorney General gets very nervous when I talk about cleaning up corruption. I find that interesting, given that he's a top law enforcement officer. But you've seen how much the corruption has touched that office, how many people on his staff are actually now in prison as a result of corruption. And I'm going to continue to sweep that out. I don't care if it's in my administration, or I don't care if it's in my office, anyone else's office. I don't care what party someone is. We need to clean this state up. People have an expectation of good government, of transparent government. And that's something that I'm going to strive for and demand of the people who work in this administration.
What are your thoughts about the recommendations have been made by several, to include the Bluegrass Institute, about revising Kentucky's open meetings and open record laws and updating them after 40 years. Do you think it's time to take a look at those, or do you feel we're good where we are?
I'm a big fan of always updating and looking at. Doesn't mean you have to change. But just this discussion right now about updating NAFTA, for example, at the federal level, why wouldn't we? After some decades, it makes sense to always go back and look. It's, again, one of the things I've pledged to do with this cutting of red tape. I said I'm going to cut 30% of all the regulation in Kentucky over 3 years. Well, how do you start? You start by reviewing what you actually have. And so we have 4,700 regulations in Kentucky. We've already reviewed 2,000 of them, and we're continuing to move through them. As it relates to all these other, open records and other type of statutes that are on the books, let's look at them. Maybe they make good sense. Maybe they don't. Let's update them and modernize them if, in fact, they need it.